Hello everyone, I'm Priyadarshini Mahara, faculty at the Department of Buddhist Studies, University of Delhi. Today, I'm going to talk to you about module number 28, which is titled Concept of Samsara and Nirvana. This module belongs to Philosophy of Buddhism, paper number 11. So when we look at the title of this module, it says Samsara and Nirvana. So what do we understand by these two words? When we talk about samsara, it means cycle, cyclic, repetition, life, course, going, wandering. These are all synonyms which we can ascribe to samsara, but which does not imply the possibility of dramatic change, but implies repetition of the same thing with maybe minor variations. It is nonetheless a repetition. So when we talk about these repetitive cycle of life, it is known as samsara. So these changes may not be minor or major, but however, it can be both. So when we talk about this concept of samsara and nirvana, we see that it is prevalent in every form or in every philosophy. However, the Madhyamik school lays more importance to this concept of samsara and nirvana. So Madhyamik looks at everything through the lens of two truths. As we've talked in our different module about Nagarjuna on two truths. So here we see that Madhyamik philosophy, for them it is important that you have an understanding of the two truths. Only then you can move ahead. So the two truths are that of conventional truth and ultimate truth. So when we look at the conventional truth, it is also known as relative truth, which means vyavhar or samvriti. And when we talk about the ultimate truth, it is the absolute truth, which is also known as paramarth. What is valid from the standpoint of the relative truth of our everyday world is not necessarily valid from the ultimate side. So when we look at the validity of what we see through the lens of this Samvriti Satya, it points out to all that is present in the empirical world. So as we've talked earlier, you here will have to make a relation between the two truths, because when we talk about the concept of samsara and nirvana, it stands on these two truths. So if you have this proper understanding of what these two truths are, then you'll be able to understand what samsara and nirvana is, because it is the same thing. As we talk about Samvriti Satya, it is samsara, and when we look through Paramarth Sat, it is nirvana that we're talking about. So when we talk about Samvriti, we are pointing out to the samsara. Samvriti Satya is defined as something which is merely apparently true, but in reality it is an illusion. So when we're talking about samsara, we are pointing out through this illusory action. In the final analysis, though the relative and the ultimate are neither different nor identical, nor does one stand independently of other, the same can be said of samsara and nirvana. So when we talk about the final analysis of Samvriti and Paramarth, we see that they are in a relation, and only the understanding of Samvriti leads to the understanding of Paramarth. So the same way when we talk about samsara and nirvana, we see that the understanding of samsara is necessary in order to understand what nirvana means. So until and unless you don't have this understanding of the samsaric actions or the samsaric life, you would not have an understanding of something that lies beyond, and that is the absolute or nirvana. In Madhyamik, samsara represents the world of birth and death. the world of suffering, while Nirvana represents realization of the ultimate truth, without which freedom from the bondage of suffering is not possible. So when we look at the main or the fundamental doctrine of Buddha, after attaining enlightenment, he talked about the Four Noble Truths. So when he talks about the Four Noble Truths, or when he gave the doctrine of Four Noble Truths, or Chatvari Arya Sat, the first truth states that there is suffering, and the second truth states that there is a cause of suffering. The third truth says that there is cessation of suffering, and the fourth truth states that there is a path that leads to this cessation of suffering. So now when we're talking about samsara, here Buddha realized that the entire phenomenal existence is endowed with suffering. There is not even a single being that does not suffer every moment of his life. Since the time we are conceived in our mother's womb, the time we take birth, and our sustenance or our life in this phenomenal existence till we die, it is all endowed with suffering. And this suffering, the important point to be noted here is that this suffering does not end with death. Death is just a cessation for a moment. Then we are conceived again, and this goes on. The cycle of birth and rebirth goes on and on till the time we don't break this bond of suffering. So this realization that the entire phenomenal existence is full of suffering, and there is a cause to that suffering, which is attachment or trishna. Trishna is called in Sanskrit, and in Pali we call it tanha. So till the time we have this attachment, we are going to suffer. So that becomes the cause of suffering. Now the third truth states that there is cessation of suffering. So the first truth, two truths point out to the samsaric existence. Now the third truth points out to the cessation of suffering, which is a state of the attainment of absolute. So that is the state of nirvana. And now the fourth truth talks about the path that leads to the cessation of suffering. So when we look at these four truths, we see that they are being divided into samsaric existence as well as the nirvana. So when the third truth, we talk about the third truth, it points out to the ultimate or nirvana. So that is the whole idea. So when we talk about the truths, Four Noble Truths, so the entire samsara and nirvana, the understanding of the phenomenal existence as well as the ultimate lies within these four truths. As noted, one sense of nirvana is that of unbinding. So when we talk about the cessation of suffering, that is unbinding from the suffering, from the cycle of birth and death. In the Madhyamik Karika of root verses on the middle way, or which is known as Mool Madhyamik Karika, Nagarjuna says, if binding would exist prior to one who is bound, there would be bondage, but that does not exist. So Nagarjuna points out to this point of unbinding and says that if binding would exist prior to one who is bound, there would be bondage, but that does not exist. Binding belongs to the relative truth. So unbinding belongs to nirvana and binding belongs to the relative truth. Because how does binding belongs to the relative truth? When we talk about the relative truth, we are pointing out to the samsaric existence. Now this samsaric existence, or even can be called phenomenal existence. Phenomenal existence is a constituent of lot of factors. So every being in the phenomenal existence is dependent on certain other conditions for its coming into being, for its sustenance, as well as for its dissolution. So we see that there are these factors that are playing role here, and those factors bind you into what you are. There is no essence or identity of your own. It is only these factors that are binding you to who you are or giving you a temporary identity. Now, why do we say temporary identity? Why isn't this identity permanent? This identity cannot be permanent because when we look at something that is permanent, it has to stay there the way it is forever. But when we talk about impermanency of phenomenal existence, we are stating that everything is in a constant flux, or the things are endowed with this idea or with this truth of momentariness. So nothing can be same for another second or another moment, because this change occurs even unit of a fraction of time. So sometimes these changes are apparent to the eyes, but sometimes, most of the times, if you see, then these changes are just not visible. But it's not that they do not occur. They do occur every second or every fraction of a second. So this is the reason that you cannot have a permanent identity or permanent existence. Because if you are something right now, the very next moment you become something else. It is just this whole identification understanding that we give when we talk about a particular thing and naming a particular thing by deciding what form does it have, what roop or what name does it have. When we talk about naam in roop, it is only this that we're pointing out to, that naam, name and roop form is given to a particular thing just for our verbal understanding. Otherwise, it is just nothing. It is a composition of constantly changing constituents. So, let us move further. When we talk about ultimately neither bondage nor anything else has inherent existence. Swabhav, own being or self, and so release from bondage is not an inherent existent phenomenon either. This is important because grasping onto the false idea of inherent existence is the primary cause of suffering. So we've talked about this right now. When we say that attachment is the root cause of all suffering, we see that what are we being attached to? We're being attached to things that are changing, things that are temporary, things that are not going to last forever. And if you grasp on to these things, if you hold on to these things, and later on the thing vanishes, you are suffering, you are in pain because you want to hold on to that thing forever till the time you exist. You want that thing to exist as well. But that is not the case. Everything is changing and everything is going to cease today or tomorrow. So Nagarjuna felt that the term nirvana was useful for indicating spiritual release, but only if the term did not refer to something that could be an object for clinging. So when we talk about nirvana, we see that it lies beyond any samsaric existence or any phenomenal existence. It cannot be clinged on to. Nirvana requires a complete cessation of grasping, including that onto nirvana itself. So, when we talk about ungrasping or unbinding of the phenomenal existence and looking forward towards nirvana, we're not saying here that you have to hold on to nirvana as a doctrine or you have to look up to nirvana as something again as attachment. While that might seem paradoxical, it is not. To grasp onto something in this sense requires inner quality or inner motivation, that one refine it. By refusing to refine liberation in virtue of seeing it as the correlative of bondage, which itself is not inherently existent, it is possible to pursue the path to liberation without creating at the same time a huge obstacle on the path, which is the root delusion with regard to nirvana itself. So, when I say that you don't have to grasp on to nirvana as attachment, so first of all, I'm asking you not to hold on to the empirical existence. And now I'm saying that even nirvana should not be held on to as empiric, as something of attachment. So this might sound paradoxical to you, that on one hand I'm saying that suffering should not be held on to, and on the other hand I'm saying that that is the state which is without suffering, but that also should not be held on to. So this is not really paradoxical. If you try to concentrate on this particular point, then you would realize that it is not contradictory or paradoxical, because by refusing to refine liberation in virtue of seeing it as the correlative of bondage, which itself is not inherently existent, it is possible to pursue the path to liberation without creating at the same time a huge obstacle on that path, which is the root delusion with regard to nirvana itself. Therefore, if things do not exist in themselves, then from the ultimate truth they are unreal or illusions. Nirvana, if seen as something inherently existent, is only an illusion that will perpetuate more grasping followed by more suffering. So, when we look at nirvana, if we see nirvana, or if we try to understand nirvana as something inherently existent, it is only an illusion. Why? Because nirvana is not inherently existent. You cannot ascribe any of the bondings or any of the binding terms to nirvana. It is something which is beyond all these terms. Nirvana cannot be put together in any term because it lies beyond these terms. It is something more. You cannot, your vocabulary cannot suffice in describing or in defining what nirvana is. Therefore, if you take it to be inherently existent, it is a mere illusion, because that will perpetuate more grasping. When things are inherently existent and you want them, you would be holding on to them. Again, the attachment, tanha, will play its role. And what will that lead to? That will lead to further suffering. And that is not what is required here. When we talk about nirvana, we're not talking about grasping onto it as something inherently existing. Rather, we're saying that the vocabulary or the grammatical performance cannot suffice in describing what it is. In fact, you cannot describe nirvana. It is just that you can give these parallels or similes or narratives in order to state how it would be attaining nirvana. But it is only when a person experiences it himself that he can understand what nirvana is. There are no real distinctions in Madhyamik philosophy because all things are considered empty of inherent existence or own nature. For samsara and nirvana to be distinct from one another, they would have to be inherently existent things. But they are empty, and within this emptiness, they are without distinction. They are only different in relative sense because they designate entirely different things. In the ultimate sense, there is no difference because of their emptiness. So when we talk about the relativity, or when we look at it from the Samvriti point of view, we see that they are distinct. We see that these two terms, nirvana and samsara, are distinct only from the empirical point of view. But when we look at it from the ultimate point of view, we see that they are empty of essence, and therefore they are not distinct, because they both point out to the same thing, and that is emptiness of any sort of essence. To know things they are actually are, free the mind of presuppositions and the emotions from attachment. Freedom is also a purification process. It removes such evils as hatred, fear, greed, or enmity which accompany attachment. Without suffering, one can never know any release. So only once you have suffering, you would know that there is something which lies beyond this suffering, and you would go looking for that thing that lies beyond suffering. And until and unless you don't suffer, you would not value those times when you are not suffering. So when we talk about pain and pleasure, when we talk about bad times and good times, so do you think you would be able to make out that this is a good time until and unless you know what is a bad time? It is only when you have suffered the bad times you would know that, okay, now is the good time. So, if we can understand that samsara is nirvana in this way, in each moment, and know that suffering ultimately related to our goal is the very tool that allows us to reach the goal, then I think we are one step closer to where we want to be. So, the understanding of suffering is related to our ultimate goal, that is nirvana. Therefore, the understanding of samsara is equally important in order to reach the state of nirvana. As we've talked earlier, we see that samsara and nirvana are two terms. When we look at them from the relative point of view, we see that they differ, because samsara points out to ever-changing constant flux of existence. The things are in movement, and they are just not temporary, permanent. They are always in a moment, and they keep changing and depending on other factors. And on the other hand, when we talk about nirvana, it takes you out from all the suffering, from all the bondage, from all conditions. And when we look at the same two concepts from the point of view of the ultimate truth, or Paramarth Sat, we see that this points out to the absolute, but it also states that both samsara and nirvana, seen together from the point of view of absolute, states that they are both empty of any essence. So that means nihi swabhav. Of course, we need to take that extra step of realizing that the goal of freedom is ultimately empty. For as long as we live, we will experience suffering in one form or the other. The goal of complete release is an illusion. There is only the endless further. So, until and unless you do not realize the notion of suffering, or that the entire phenomenal existence is endowed with suffering, for you the goal of anything would be an illusion. Because reaching that goal will not give you happiness, but a mere illusion, and enhance your suffering. And at the same time, once you have realized that there is something that lies beyond, that would truly take you out of your suffering, you would be looking on to that goal, and that is the attainment of nirvana. So when we look at some extent, when we talk about shunyata or emptiness, we see that to some extent Shunyata is an extension of the concepts made explicit in certain flaws. All things being impermanent, nothing can be seen as having independent, lasting form of existence. And this is, in essence, what Shunyata is all about. Shunyata can be defined as Nihi Swabhav or no essence. The concept Swabhav means own being and something like substance or essence. So, Swabhav has to do with the notion that there is a form of being which is and exists in a form that is not dependent on context or that is not related to the subject. So, when we talk about Ni Swabhav, we pointing out to this missing of that identity or existence in a particular substance or in empirical existence. As we've talked earlier, that these two concepts of samsara and nirvana are close to the Mahayan school of Buddhism. So, Mahayan claims itself to be an important vehicle to liberation, but it also points to its own provisional character. They do not see itself as an end, but as means to an end. When we talk about Mahayan school, we are stating that when Mahayan says about samsara and nirvana, about samvriti and paramarth, they are not saying that it is itself an end, but they pointing out that they are the means to an end. So Mahayan claims to be showing the path that leads you out of the samsaric existence to the higher existence, and that is nirvana. So when we talk about samsara and nirvana, these are the two key concepts that are related to samvriti and paramarth. It is samsara that we look and describe as samvriti, and it is nirvana that we look and describe or point out to as paramarth or the ultimate. That end is liberation, enlightenment, and an end to suffering. The end that we're talking about, or which Mahayan claims to be the means to reaching, is basically the end of suffering and the attainment of enlightenment. However, when we look at all the other schools of Buddhism, the ultimate goal of every school or every sect is the attainment of enlightenment. And as with all religions, there is a tendency for the religion to reinforce itself as real, as an end in itself within the minds of the adherents. The philosophical traditions of emptiness and dependent co-origination are important correctives to this tendency. So, the dependent origination and emptiness are the two factors which hold importance when we talk about samsara and nirvana, or when we talk about even the two truths, which is samvriti and paramarth. The dependent origination points out that every phenomenal existence is dependent on certain other factors for its existence. Can you name me a thing which is not dependent on any other factor for its existence? You would not be able to, because there is nothing that exists in the phenomena and is freely existing and is not dependent on anything for its origination, for its sustenance, and for its dissolution. So, there is an important saying within Zen Buddhism: if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. When people come to see the Buddha as being to be revered merely for the sake of piety itself, or when Buddhism itself became the chief focus of its practitioner, then it is time to kill that particular attachment that is arising, to point to the emptiness and provisional quality of Buddhism itself. So when Buddhism is talking about a particular doctrine or when Nagarjuna for that matter says that this is the middle path, avoid the two extremes. So that he is not pointing out to the doctrine or to the middle path to be followed as a dogma or a doctrine. Anything that turns into a dogma or a doctrine will lead to suffering, cannot take you out from that suffering. And the same is true when we talk about samsara and nirvana. Looking at nirvana from the point of view of samsara does not really takes you to nirvana. You have to come out of that inherent existence. You have to come out to that holding on or grasping. And that is when you will reach the state of nirvana or the absolute attainment. So samsara holds equal importance in the attainment of nirvana. It is only when you are understanding the suffering of samsara that you look for something that lies beyond, and that lies beyond is nirvana. So these are the two key concepts of samsara and nirvana which hold importance in every philosophical aspect of Buddhism and in every ethical aspect of Buddhism. I hope you got a good understanding of what we were trying to make you understand here. Thank you.